Another area that a chief security officer may oversee is the creation of an information security policy for the entire organization. So, what is an information security policy? It's a written document describing what is and is not permissible use of information in the organization and the consequences for violating the policy. An information security policy is required by a variety of regulations, such as Sarbanes-Oxley Act. It is also often required by insurance companies because the risks the risks associated with not complying with some of the typical security regulations of applicable laws can be so high that that may adversely impact insurance companies as well. So it's also linked to the legislature sometimes. So who should develop the security policy? A policy committee with representatives of all relevant or affected user groups and stakeholders within an organization should be formed. Probably the chief security officer should participate in the committee in the early phases, at least when it comes to forming the committee, but then the committee can have a chair that leads all the discussions and deliberations in relation to an information security policy. Also, the committee should meet regularly, so it's not just about forming the committee and developing the policy. It's also about making sure that the committee meets regularly to ensure that the policy that they have developed continues to meet the organization needs and satisfies current regulations, because things can change very fast in the information security domain. New threats may emerge, so the policy needs to be up to date to reflect all the recent developments in information security threats and also applicable legislature. And then it is managers who are responsible for communicating, training, and enforcing, communicating and training in relation to the requirements of that policy, and also enforcing the policy across the organization. So, what are the typical contents of the policy? Well, typical contents include access control policies, which outline who has access to what, under what conditions, with what precautions. Especially access control policies are important for external users, so external access policies need to be outlined as well. And in addition to user policies, meaning the rights of users in relation to accessibility of information systems assets, there needs to be a physical policy that outline physical access to information systems assets, such as rooms, uh, computer labs, server rooms, and things like that. Because physical aspect of security, information system security, should not be overlooked. As I provided some examples before, sometimes it's not about hardware and software security, but physical security of equipment. Somebody can come in and physically damage a server or relocate it, put it in another place with malicious purposes. There are some organizations that provide templates of security policies. Now, this is the link to one of those training and certification organizations, and you can download their templates for an organization information security policy. Some general guidelines for developing those policies. Policies should be appropriate for the estimated risks of the organization. It depends what kind of organization it is and what kind of industry it is in. Of course, an organization handling sensitive data, such as banks or financial institutions, may have much more stringent regulations in relation to accessibility of information systems assets, while organizations that don't have that degree of risk associated with security breaches, for example, I don't know, a small store or a retailer, they may have a less stringent information security policy. Also, policies should be flexible enough so that they can be quickly modified when new situations arise affecting security. And also, if a policy gets changed or updated, all affected organizational members should be notified about those policy modifications. But all in like one important requirement for any kind of policy is that it should be easily accessible by employees. And I would also add that accessibility is not just about physical access, it's also about making the policy simple enough so that an average employee can actually read and understand it. Because there are so many organizations that hire consulting companies to develop like 500-page policy, and then even the person who ordered it on behalf of the organization does not even read it, because it just too long and complicated. It needs to be short and practical. Now, the final area that may be a responsibility of a chief security officer that we will discuss is business continuity planning in relation to information systems. So, business continuity planning typically involves creating plans to ensure that employees and business processes can continue when faced with any major anticipated disruptions. Research shows that businesses that are not prepared for major disruption, businesses that cannot resume operations in a reasonable time frame, often go out of business. There are many cases of that. Some of those cases are quite tragic. For example, um, during the 9/11 terrorist attack, a lot of some organizations that were hosted by the World Trade Center complex, or financial institutions like trading companies or hedge funds or something like that. And during those tragic events, they lost so many employees, they lost their records, they lost their servers, and a lot of them went out of business because they just could never recover from that loss. I mean, they could never recover from the disruption. Again, the reason I'm bringing those companies up, it just shows how multidimensional risk is. I mean, I'm sure a lot of those people who are working for those hedge funds, in many ways, they are experts in risk, but only in one narrow dimension of risk, which is financial risk. They never thought about the possibility of an airplane crashing into their office building and destroying their records and killing their key employees. Again, Nassim Taleb reflects on that incident in his book, Fooled by Randomness, and he actually says that when he worked in risk management, his boss, and he calls him Frenchman in New York. It's like I guess metaphor for somebody or some broader concept. So he called anyways, that Frenchman in New York. He was obsessed with risk, according to Nassim Taleb, and he would force people to brainstorm about possible threats to their business, even if those threats seem to be very unlikely and crazy. And according to Nassim Taleb, during one of those risk brainstorming sessions, somebody actually came up with this idea that at some point an airline might crash into their office building because their office was somewhere in Manhattan in one of those high rises. So they did not rule out that possibility that an airplane may crash. So they actually developed like a response strategy to that, something that sounded crazy and highly unlikely at that time, but something that eventually happened 20 years later. So some steps for business continuity planning. First of all, define the critical business processes and departments so that you understand what you're protecting, what you're recovering from a disaster. Identify interdependencies between those business processes and departments. This will help you to understand what kind of consequences loss of a particular process or department or node within your organizational network may have on other processes because of those dependencies. It will be easier to understand that loss. Examine all possible disruptions to these systems. Again, that's a fascinating topic of how you do that, right? How do you foresee something that by definition cannot be predicted? There are some techniques for that. It requires like diversity of opinions and creativity and brainstorming to come up with all possible negative scenarios. Also, you need to gather quantitative and qualitative information on these threats. A lot of risk management professionals, they're like mathematicians, statisticians. They approach things quantitatively, but a lot of things in life and business and specifically in relation to risk, they can only be qualitatively assessed, right? They can hardly be quantified or quantified with the desired level of precision. So sometimes it's just a matter of qualitative opinion whether a particular risk is facing an organization and how great that risk is. Because, for example, Nassim Taleb explains that statistics is all about making predictions based on past data. That's the essence of statistics. You collect data, and that data becomes past data because you collected it from the past, and then you build some kind of model to predict the future. And that's the fundamental flaw that past does not necessarily predict the future. So sometimes and how do you collect past data about something that has never occurred, the so-called black swan? So that requires more or less an opinion or a qualitative opinion that may be unfortunately as valid as detailed quantitative analysis. And then giving the risk that you have identified, you need to provide remedies for restoring systems, both technical and procedural. So you need to have some technical solutions in place for restoring your information systems assets from backups, and also You need to have rules and policies for people, for employees, when it comes to resuming their operations. Some additional suggestions for business continuity plans. Plan for alternate workspaces for people with working computers and phone lines if their main office is inaccessible. Backup IT sites should be not too close but not too far away. If they are too close, they may be unavailable due to the same natural, let's say, disaster. But if they're too far away, then connectivity may be an issue. It may be difficult to travel between those data centers, between the data centers and your headquarters for recovery purposes. Also, business continuity plans need to contain up-to-date evacuation plans that everybody knows and hopefully has practiced. Also, you need to have provisions for backed up laptops and department servers, because a lot of data, organizational data, is actually stored on those end user computers and not necessarily in a central data warehouse or data center. Also, for recovery purposes, you need to have easily accessible phone lists, email lists, or even instant messaging lists so that people can contact each other during an emergency. Now, of course, this assumes that the public infrastructure will be available after a particular disruption. The article that I would like you to read in relation to business continuity planning actually makes a point that this is not the case. Sometimes not sometimes, but quite often public infrastructure is not accessible due to water damage. For example, cell phone towers may be knocked off. There may be riots. There may be some disturbances that will prevent you from using roads or any other public infrastructure. So that completes our chapter 14 video presentation related to information system security, risk management, and business continuity planning.